Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea.
Welcome to the Great Lakes Guys podcast. We have a very special guest today. With us is Sue Murray. She volunteers with the YankeeAirMuseum near Ypsilanti, Michigan, to play as a Rosie, as in Rosie the Riveter. The museum is on the site of the former Willow Run bomber plant, the location for the manufacture of the B-24 Liberator bombers during World War II. Because of the lack of male workers during World War II, the arsenal of democracy needed labor to produce the required war material to defeat the Axis powers. Women were there to fill that need. Sue will tell us how the women of the time stepped into the role and were equal to the task of the male factory workers in the very demanding circumstances of the bomber plant.
Hardy are the seamen on the ships that load the iron ore, hauling out of Thunder Bay, bound for Buffalo. And hardy are the fishermen, like their fathers were before. They say, bury me at sea when it's my time to go. Sweet Mother Michigan.
Today we have Sue Murray. She's a volunteer with the YankeeAirMuseum here in Ypsilanti, Michigan. And she's going to tell us about her role as a Rosie the Riveter at the museum. So take it away, Sue. Let us know about maybe you should let us know a little bit about what you do at the museum, and then sort of backtrack and give us a little bio, about your life. And then we'll come back to the museum activities, and you can start talking about what it's like to be a Rosie the Riveter.
Okay. Well, we're tribute Rosies, and we pay honor to the women and their legacy that stepped up during World War II that are considered what we call the original Rosies. And anytime that we can take to the public their story, let them know what the women did on the home front. You hear all the stories of the veterans, the Battle of the Bulge or Iwo Jima. You read all these things in your history books, and you never read what the women did. Mm-hmm. And so we take it upon ourselves to make sure that the public is aware and that story doesn't get lost as our original Rosies, just like our original vets, are starting to age out. The stories are being lost. So we try to preserve all their stories.
Yes, that's very true. I think there's most of the Rosies left are over 100 years old, right, or something like that. Yeah.
There are a few that are in their 90s because a few of them erased their birth certificate date when they were a few older, so they could work in the factories. But they're in their mid 90s to 105, 106. Yeah. And with that type of age, it's short-lived now. So
okay. So can you tell us a little bit about your life and how you got to the point you are now?
For being a Rosie?
For being a Rosie.
Well, I've always been a volunteer in some way, shape, or form in my life. I was a volunteer police auxiliary, and I was a volunteer with the band boosters. And I've always tried to give back to community. And I've known all my life about Rosie the Riveter, or the Rosies of the war, my grandmother having been one. But I didn't know that there was actually this organization out here until they had the world record in 2017. So I joined then. And as I met the ladies, I call them my Rosie sisters, the tribute Rosies. Mm-hmm. As I met them along the way, I started joining the groups that you can join. There's the drill team. I was on that for 7 years, I think. And I was on the educational committee and helped set up the criteria for the presentations or the storyline.
This is with the museum.
With the Rosie organization.
Rosie
Run Tribute Rosies.
I see. Okay.
And we do veterans events, we do museum events. Anything that has to do with the original Rosies. I've stood honor guard at a original Rosie's funeral.
Mhm.
Just anything to, bring them the respect and for people to know who they are, and then deserve the public, what do I want to say, the publication or to get their story out, so people know, because I've talked to kids in school and some of them don't even know. They know it's the symbol with the arm and the bandana, but they don't know what it represents. And so I've done actually a presentation at the high school, and so that they understand the story.
So where did you come from? Where did you grow up?
Downriver. I mostly have lived in Southgate all my life. Went to Southgate High School.
People might not know what you mean by downriver.
Okay. Downriver is along the river south of Detroit.
Yeah.
Between Detroit and Monroe.
Okay.
Downriver is right about the middle.
I see. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so anything about your education that you might want to mention?
Well, I was on school board for 12 years, held all offices, president, vice president, and such. And education's always been really important to me. So I consider doing the presentations or telling the history of Rosie as part of a history lesson or learning opportunity. And I worked for the police department, and I worked for the local post office, and I just always Southgate.
Okay.
I was a Southgate bus driver for schools.
I see. Okay, so you had a variety of jobs around Southeast Michigan.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, always around Southeast Michigan. Okay, so tell us how you prepare to be a Rosie. It must be, you must have to spend a lot of time, maybe a fair amount of reading and then talking to other Rosies and to get some idea about how to be a Rosie.
Well, when I first joined, I was given a packet to fill out by our lead Rosie. And it you talked about what you knew about Rosies, what you expected to do as a Rosie, maybe ideas you had that you'd like to bring to the organization, or any skills you might have if you could sew or, and help with those kinds of things. And so you filled all that out, and it was like a small interview process, and then you became a Rosie. So that's what I did. Excuse me.
So, what did, I know she's called Rosie the Riveter, but so what did Rosie do besides be a riveter, or what did her tasks include being a riveter?
Okay, well, the term is loosely used.
Yeah.
In the beginning, they had Betty the Bucker and Wendy the Welder and Settling Annie and Rosie the Riveter, and I think it was Franny the Farmer, and all the men jobs. They had these little nicknames. Rosie the Riveter is the one that really stuck, and I think because of the song Rosie the Riveter and the iconic symbol, But what constitutes a Rosie is any woman during World War II that stepped into a man's position. If you were the retail clerk and the manager went off to war and you took over management, you're considered a Rosie, because on the home front, you were doing the man's job while he was off at war.
I see.
So anything on the home front, the recycling, the victory gardens. Victory gardens are gardens because food was rationed, and they tried to get as much food to the soldiers or I call them all soldiers, the Marines, Navy, all of them, and to get it to the men serving as they could. So things were so rationed at home. If you had a little plot of land or a little section, maybe you grew the tomatoes and she grew the lettuce and she grew the carrots, and together your neighborhood made a salad. So people had these victory gardens where they would help each other out. They had recycling drives where people would bring the old junky tricycles and wagons that were all rusting and can't use anymore or broken down. And they would, a lot of times they bring them to the center of town. They'd have a big drive, and that metal was melted down and reused to make war weapons.
Yes.
So, anything of that type of work. If you sat on the tractor when the farmer went off to war, you were Rosie. If you worked a USO, and brought comfort to the soldiers when they were home. You were a Rosie, you were helping on the home front. If you sold war bonds, any of those types of things now is under the umbrella of being a Rosie. So when you ask people, do you have Rosies in your family? Do you know what grandma did or great grandma did? And they'll say, I don't think she did anything. She just, was home. She might have had a victory garden, or she might have done recycling, or she might have sold war bonds, or did civil defense with lights out, and those kinds of things on the home front, because not everybody could go into a factory.
Yeah.
But that makes them all Rosies.
So who organized this civilian effort? It must have been several organizations, right? There, like the food, like who organized collecting the food that was grown and that kind of thing. Do you know?
I think it was more they sort of did it and like in the city and stuff.
Yeah.
Now the farm, I know some of the ranchers, they called it a pick garden, and they would keep what they needed, and then they would take to town and sell or donate or whatever what was extra.
I see.
And I know they did that.
Okay.
So.
And did people sew clothing and stuff like that for the military?
Well, you couldn't buy clothes. You had to like make your own.
Oh, you had to make your. I see.
And when you look at shirts back in the wartime, a shirt, one pocket, you won't find two.
Oh, I see. It's interesting. Yeah, that's interesting, huh? Okay.
Very interesting.
And
just little things, just every kind of effort, any way they could help save or recreate or redo. I know there were two Rosies when they were little girls. They were 8 and 10, I believe. They went out and picked great big huge bags of milkweed because you can use the milkweed. For parachutes or
fibers or something.
Yeah, right. And so they were considered Rosies on the home front, and they would bring these bags in from the fields. So they're one of the younger ones now because they were so young at the time.
I see.
Young girls working in victory gardens. They're one of the younger Rosies.
I see.
But the factory workers, you had to be 18 to work in a factory. So when girls wanted to work in a factory and they were only 16 or 17, they'd get out the eraser and they would change the date on their birth certificate. And some of the girls were 15 or 16.
Oh, that young.
Yeah. And they would make the date so they would be 18 so they could get hired. Yeah. A couple of them, they were sent home.
Yeah.
They realized that. Yeah.
So, so when did women start really working in the bomber plant here in Ypsilanti? When did they start working in sort of large numbers?
Well, the bomber plant was started in March of 41, my understanding. We weren't really involved in the war until December of 41.
Right, yeah.
So then the plant was finished around July of 42. But even before it was finished, they started at one, it was the largest manufacturing plant in the world, and they started at one end building it. And so when that was complete, someone could actually work in there while they were still finishing the other end. So I don't know the exact date that women came in, but I know the first bomber was in September.
Yeah.
And the 1,000
of 41.
42.
42, September 42. Okay.
And the 1,000th bomber was in November of 42.
Wow. Okay.
So they've made 1,000 bombers within a couple months.
Wow.
But as you check the timeline, that window got smaller and smaller because they were more proficient, and it was faster and faster production.
So what kind of training did the Rosies get in the plant?
Well, a lot of the Rosies, being most women back in the day, you were a housewife. So you went to school to maybe 8th grade, and then 9th grade was considered high school, and that's where the guys went. The girls were done. You just needed enough math that you could figure out the grocery bill. So the women, they would have training like crocheting or sewing or cooking or raising children. That was their training because their job was going to be a housewife. And so you went from your father's home to your husband's home. You didn't have your independence. That was how things ran back then.
Yeah.
So the women, when they had to go out, we need you in the factories. We need you to help on the war front, come. And when the women came to the factories, they were asked what skills they had. And a lot of women say, well, I'm just a housewife.
Yeah.
And they say, well, what hobbies do you have? What do you like to do? And if they say crochet, can you read intricate patterns? Or,
Yeah.
yeah, well, maybe you could do wiring harnesses in the cockpit. Let's see if you have a propensity for that. And then they would, maybe they sewed clothes. So maybe you can read patterns, maybe blueprints. So they tried to take what skills they had that would be easily converted into factory skills. And the ones who really didn't have something, then they would just see where they fit in and fill the gaps with the others. But some of the women who worked on farms, handled tools and sharpening the tools and such. So they were more with the tools. They were with the rivets and acetylene torches and things.
I see. So what was a typical day like for a riveter, a woman riveter in the plant?
Well, at Willow Run, the women were working 10-hour days.
10-hour days. Wow.
6 days a week.
Wow.
2 shifts.
Okay. Yeah.
Now in the beginning, it increased as production increased, but that was in the beginning. It was a full-time job. And at the time when the war broke out, minimum wage was 30 cents an hour.
Wow.
Our minimum wage is $10 and something an hour. Okay, so if you do the comparison from nowadays till back then, the women were offered at the Willow Run plant $1.10 an hour, what a man earned. And so maybe $1.25 an hour.
Yeah.
So that's 4 times 30 cents. So 4 times $10 today, that'd be like $40 an hour.
Yeah.
That's why so many women wanted to come to Willow Run.
I see.
Because they wanted to pay them like women. And Clara Ford said, if you don't pay them like a man, you expect them to leave their home, leave their kids, leave their education, leave their state, and come here and work in a man's job, that heavy, dirty job, and do that heavy work and be in a factory all day. You better pay them like a man or they're not going to come.
Clara Ford was the wife of Henry Ford?
I don't know whose wife she was.
Maybe she Edsel Ford's wife.
Yeah, it was one of the wives. But she insisted that they got paid like a man. So they did. And there were women down like in Tennessee and Kentucky. They go to the bus station and say, I want a ticket to that city in Michigan where they pay you like a man.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the bus people knew Ypsilanti. The women couldn't say the word,
Yeah.
And they'd say, you want Ypsilanti? Do you want a round trip? They say, no, one way.
One way.
They were bound and determined. They were going to come here, get a job, be paid like a man, and work in the factory and help the war effort. They weren't taking no for an answer.
Right. So there must have been immediate housing problem.
Yes, very much so. You didn't have apartment complexes and such like you do today. And they had some Quonset huts out on the property put up, but it wasn't sufficient, of course. And sometimes 2 families had to live in one hut and, that sort of thing. And they had a thing called pallet shacks where they would take the pallets and break them down and build shacks out of them just for a place to sleep. But that was mostly some of the men and, the little people men that couldn't serve in the military. They would work in the factory.
I see.
And so Rosie, a lot of them had to rent out a room.
Yeah.
So if you had you and your husband and you had your son and your son went off to war, you had an empty bedroom. And so then the Rosie would rent the room, but she didn't have cooking or laundry facilities, but she had a place to sleep. So a lot of that went on around the factory.
I see.
And some of the women, I understand, mailed their dirty clothes home.
Oh, really?
They would have double, 2
Yeah.
outfits and wear one week and the other was in the mail going home for laundry. Mom would wash everything down in Kentucky or Tennessee and ship it back. And then she'd have her clean clothes and mail the dirty ones back down. And they just kept sending their clothes back and forth because you didn't have laundromats.
Yeah, that's right. There weren't any laundromats. There was a reliable mail service, apparently, though.
It must have worked because that's what they did. I have been told that some of the women rented the same room because they worked shift work. One would sleep in the bed and then the other one would come home and sleep in the bed.
Yeah.
It got to the point where you were sharing everything. Yeah.
So there must have been in the factory. Were there separate medical facilities for the women, or in the men, or were they combined? I mean, because
I know.
women have special problems. Yeah.
And so in the infirmary, it was more like a, what we would call like urgent care
Yeah,
today.
urgent care,
It was like urgent care, but it was right in the factory.
Yeah.
So I'm sure they would both use the same facility
Yeah.
because they would have the rooms and,
Mhm.
whatever the doctor had to take
I
care
see.
of or the nurse would take care of. And they had a cafeteria for food,
Uh-huh.
so the women had something to eat, and it wasn't like a cafeteria where you put a nickel in and get a sandwich out of, it was someone serving you
Yeah.
food.
And did they have to pay for that, or was that provided by the factory?
I think they had to pay.
They had to pay. Uh-huh.
I'm not positive. I don't ever remember hearing that it was free.
Uh-huh. I see.
So, but they did provide the service.
And who paid the wages? Like, was it were the wages subsidized by the federal government, or did Ford Motor Company pay the wages?
Well, everyone I talked to said that they got paid by Fords,
They got paid by Ford.
the women that I spoke with. Now, whether some of that money came from the government to subsidize
Yeah.
Fords for doing it, or if the government subsidized Fords for changing over from building cars to building tanks, or building will-run factory, because that was an agricultural school back in the day. So I don't know if that had any connection, but
Yeah.
I know the women always talked about getting paid from Fords.
Uh-huh.
And the advertisement was from Fords.
Uh-huh. So did they have the ones that came, say, from Kentucky or Tennessee? They must have established like bank accounts locally or something like that in order to protect their money. Did they have a problem keeping their money somewhere safe?
No, I don't know that either. That's a good question that when the next time I have an interview with one of the women, to ask them. Because I know a lot of them got paid in cash.
Yeah,
They didn't get a check.
Oh, they got paid in, yeah.
Yeah, they would get an envelope with the cash in it, and on the outside of the envelope would be written their hours. And then the total money that they earned, and then the money would be in the envelope. So they didn't really have, some of them had time cards, not all of them,
Yeah.
but they didn't really have like how you would expect when you work at the factory, you get your check every.
Yeah.
They just got cash.
That seems a little risky, I mean, carrying around that kind of cash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was considered big money back
Yeah.
then. Those women made a lot of money compared to what all the other women were
Mhm.
making.
So how did they get to work? I mean, because if they came up from the South, they didn't have their own transportation likely, right?
Mhm.
So how did they get from the various little maybe rentals they were staying at, or maybe they were in this maybe some of them were even in Detroit, I suppose,
I do know of some that
Yeah.
were like along the river in
Yeah.
Detroit, and they had to come into town, and they
Yeah.
didn't have I-94 yet.
Yeah.
So you had to take Michigan Avenue or
Mhm.
one of the other roads. And they started a lot of carpooling,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't really hear too much about carpooling back then, but if one person had a car and two or three people close by were going, they would share their gas rations, and then they would all ride in the car to go to work. And then the lady who had the car that was driving them to work would get the riders ration cards, and it would help pay for the gas.
So if they had a 10-hour day,
Mhm.
did that go from like 7 in the morning till 5 at night or something like that? Or what were the hours that
It was a day shift and an afternoon shift. I don't know the exact hours,
Mhm.
but I know, I think they had like, one was leaving as one was coming in kind of a thing. And then in the middle of the night, they didn't have production.
They
And I don't
didn't.
know if there was ever talk about doing a third shift,
Uh-huh.
but as far as I know, they didn't have one.
I see.
think the war ended before they
Yeah.
got to that point.
I see.
Mhm.
So what kind of was there strife between the men and the women in the plant, over because women,
I think
the
in
men had
beginning,
more.
yeah, because it was a man's world,
Yeah.
Women, how dare they come into the factory,
Mhm.
and that was the mindset back then.
Mhm.
But as more and more men got drafted, and we were attacked by the Japanese with Pearl Harbor, and a couple days later, Germany declared war on us, and we have war on two fronts.
Yes.
Guys were going right and left to war.
Yeah.
You had to bring the people in, or they would not have a gun or a
Yeah.
uniform or a tank, or,
Yeah.
they needed this equipment. So they were more open to the women doing it. Now, the men who were left at the factories were like 4F
Mm-hmm.
or the little people men,
Mm-hmm.
or it was the men who had special skills where they would teach the women.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Maybe a real good riveter would teach the women how to rivet, and someone who did welding or did blueprints, they would stay behind, but all the rest of the guys had to go to war. So the women, I think it was about 40% of everyone in the factory was a female.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, the joke was, will it run? It's
Yeah,
the Willow run,
yeah.
because women were building this
Yeah.
aircraft. And in the beginning, I'm sure there were a lot of bad rivets
Yeah.
or misaligned this or that, because they're just all learning.
Yeah.
But as they got really proficient and the women took it very serious. It wasn't just a job in doing production, because they knew they were building those aircraft for their sons and their husbands and their brothers and their dads.
Yeah.
And they wanted to make sure it was the best that could be built so they could get home.
Yeah.
So they were very diligent in doing the best job they could. By the once their production really picked up and everybody had their skill sets in there, then it wasn't a will it run, it was, oh, it's a willow run, I'll fly that one.
Uh-huh.
You
Good.
know, it was a whole different mindset because they knew that plane was in good shape.
Okay.
Mhm.
So one is a Rosie the Riveter, actually riveting the plane.
Mhm.
Okay, so what did the riveting what was involved in the riveting job? How could they rivet for hours and hours and hours, or do they have to stop every hour because they're all shook up from the riveting gun and things like?
It's tough.
Yeah.
I took riveting class when I
Mhm.
became a Rosie, because when we were out in the public, people would say, well, do you rivet? In the beginning, I had to say no, but now I say yes,
Yeah.
because I riveted my own lunchbox.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Okay.
I had a 2x2 sheet of metal, and we had to transfer the plans, cut it, drill it, bend it, everything, rivet it together. And so I know what it takes to do the riveting, and it's a hard job.
Yeah.
And the riveter was more, you work in tandem. You have a riveter and a bucker.
A bucker.
The bucker's on the other side of the metal. They can't see you, you can't see
And is the
them.
bucker on the outside or the inside?
The riveter's on the outside and the bucker's on the inside.
Okay.
And they have the big heavy piece of steel that meets with the rivet when you're drilling the rivet through, so it flattens the other end.
Mm.
It's like you work in tandem together. And that's how it makes the seal, because
Yeah.
if you can't use screws or nuts and bolts, because vibration of the plane would loose them all up.
Right.
So you have this rivet where you smash it on one end, you drill
Yeah.
it through and smash it on the other end, and then it makes a seal. So you had to work in tandem. So you had your bucker on the inside, your riveter on the outside. And so riveting is a skill. If you slide off the rivet head, you'll put a crease in it, and they call that a smiley face.
Yeah.
That compromises the strength of the rivet and has to be drilled out and redone.
Oh,
So you don't want any smiley faces.
Yeah.
The bucker has to hold that heavy piece of steel all day. So the strength was the bucker and the skill was the riveter.
I see.
But that gun is heavy.
Yeah.
So that rivet gun, and my wrists were sore when after
Yeah.
a while, my wrists would get really sore from doing it. And I only did it like a couple hours, and they were doing it 10 hours. And other than their breaks or bathroom or lunch or whatever, they did it the whole time, as far as I know.
So in that iconic picture of the riveter, you show Rosie with a pretty muscle on her arms. Yeah.
They were very strong.
Yeah.
But they were also very creative. I know in one of the factories, they were having trouble getting the parts from the tool crib out to the floor fast enough. And so they had to rig up something to get them out there faster. So the women put on roller skates.
Oh,
And they skated the parts across the floor, and they could get there faster.
that's good. So, how many riveters? So you got this, it's a B-24. B-24. And when did they start riveting the plane? Did they wait till they kind of had pieces in place, just temporarily, and then they started riveting most of the plane, or did they just do little sections at a time, or?
They started in the back of the plant, they would start by putting pieces together. When they built the plant, they got an airplane from California where they were building
Yeah,
B-24s.
Consolidated, I think.
Yes, and they reverse engineered it. They took it apart and then they put it back together so they would see the order of how parts needed to be put on the plane to get it done right and be proficient about it. And so that's how they built the factory.
Yeah.
You know, once they took the plane apart and saw you need this part first and that part second, you don't need the wings until up here, you know, then that's how they built the plant. So everything started at the back of the plant, the back end of the plant, and moved along the production line. And that was considered extremely new, a new concept, because the engineers, when they had the big meeting about making the bomber plant, they all said, well, you can do that with cars, but you can't do that with planes.
Yeah.
And out in California, it was taken between 2 weeks and a month to do one plane. And we were flipping them off the production line one every 55 minutes on a double line.
Yeah.
So it's like they did it where everything was standardized sizing like you do on a car. You dent a door on a car. They can take a green car and take the green door and put it on a blue car, and it's going to be right, and they just have to paint it to match. And so it'll fit. They did the same thing with the wings and the tails and all the fuselage parts of the airplane, and they made everything on a production line. So everything was exactly the same size. Where at Consolidated, they were fabricating as they went along. Yeah. So if this wing went bad, you had to fabricate another wing to repair it. And it took like forever.
Yes. So
when they did the production standards, like they do in a factory, that's when the production really picked up. And the if you look at the time when our Rosie exhibit, if you look at the timeline, it was from September to November for 1,000, but then from November to December, I think, was like 2,000. I mean, it just like picked up really fast because they had all these standardized sizes and the women were very proficient. But they had the fuselage like on a conveyor, I guess you would call it. So instead of the women having to move all around, they could stand in one place, and the big machine would like move the fuselage part up and down so that she could just stand there and rivet.
I see.
And the bucker's on the other side because you had to meet with your bucker. So sometimes they had to do like a tapping or a singing with a note, or you know, some way to know when it's ready for the next one, because the bucker has to move their bucking bar along with the gun.
I see.
It has to be right in tandem, and with that big sheet of metal between, you can't see.
Yeah, and probably can't. You can't see. And so they had to make a distinctive noise so that the person on the other side could.
Sometimes they tap twice, I'm ready, and tap once, okay, let's go.
I see.
So it'd be two, like that. So they would know.
So they had to stand for hours and hours.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So mostly young people did that job, I imagine. No?
Anyone who could. My aunt was a bucker, and her son was married, so she was older.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
She wasn't real old, but she was older.
Yeah.
And she was a riveter, and her daughter-in-law was a riveter. And so when the husbands went off the war, they came to the factory. And the lady downstairs had the car, Mrs. Ruddy, and they'd all carpool with Mrs. Ruddy and share their gas stamps. And then they would go out to the factory.
Oh, that's right. They had the gasoline was rationed, wasn't it?
Yeah. Everything, tires, everything. So it was nice if you could have riders, because if you were just taking yourself back and forth to the factory, you're going to burn through all your ration stamps. And how do you get to work then?
Yeah.
You know, but if you had a couple riders that went with you, then you borrowed with their ration stamps, and they were happy to have the ride.
So the plant did the plant provide transportation for anybody? Some people coming in? I mean, were there cases where they would provide transportation into the plant?
I know that there was a subdivision like Norwayne was built, and it was housing for people in the factory. And that's out, oh man, I can't remember, Wayne Road, and I've been there, I just can't remember exactly where it is. But it was one of the first subdivisions. Instead of doing a 90-degree grid, you know.
Yeah.
And they learned if they curve and line the streets, they can fit more houses on less land.
Yeah.
And so and they had a school in there, and you know, it was all kind of self-contained,
Yeah.
so the people would live there. And then they had a bus take them from there out to the factory,
I
so
see.
they could hop the bus and get to the factory.
I see.
So there were a few of those went on, and then 94 came along, and that helped tremendously get the traffic in and out.
So they didn't call it 94 back then,
It was
though.
the Ford Freeway.
Ford Freeway, yeah. I
For
noticed
the
you.
Ford plant for the Ford Freeway.
I noticed you use the terminology which is local around here, and they call, you know, the Ford places Fords.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they don't say that other places, but
It's Ford.
yeah,
right.
Ford, yeah.
But to us,
But
we always said Ford.
Ford's-
It's like apostrophe.
apostrophe,
You
yes,
took
yeah,
the apostrophe out.
yeah.
Everyone said they worked at Ford's.
Yeah,
You know.
I know
yeah.
that's a common
Yeah,
terminology
it's
around
Ford.
here. So,
And I noticed I said that.
so, yeah, I worked at Ford's too
Mhm.
for a while. So I know you get into saying, you get into talking like that because that's the way everyone else does. So, all right, so,
You know, there were
Yeah.
Rosies in other countries.
oh,
They weren't
okay,
just United States.
yeah.
They had, well, like the Queen of England was a Rosie. I don't know if they called her that,
Mhm.
but she was a mechanic on a vehicle.
She was,
Yeah.
oh,
And when she was a princess.
oh,
And then Audrey Hepburn
Mhm.
was a young girl,
yes,
and she would ride her bicycle around. She was 14, 16, and she'd ride all around, and she was like a spy.
Mm,
And she would report to the resistance.
This would be like in France or
She was like in the Dutch area.
oh, Dutch area,
Yeah.
okay, okay.
And she
Mm.
would report like where the Nazis,
Yeah.
how many and what was there, and she would let them know information. She was just a young girl on a bike, no one paid any attention to her,
Yeah.
and she got a lot of information. And then Julia Child was, she wanted to be in the army, but they told her they didn't have uniform to fit her. She's too big of a woman because she was 6 foot tall.
That's true. She was yes.
Very large woman.
Yeah.
And so she ended up joining the OSI,
Oh, yeah.
and it was the precursor to the CIA.
Yes.
So she was that, and Betty White was in transportation, the movie star. Marilyn Monroe was a riveter on the factory
Oh,
floor.
I didn't know that.
B. Arthur was a Marine. I mean, you know, they didn't even talk about it. Hedy Lamarr, the beautiful
Oh.
Hedy Lamarr, was a brilliant mind
Yeah.
that she come up with some of the Wi-Fi precursors
Yeah.
and a lot of information, you know, a lot of technology information
Mhm.
she had. She was a very smart woman.
Mhm.
And you just think of her as a pretty face. You know, she had the war effort. But the one that the Germans were the most afraid of were the Russian female pilots, and they called them Nachthexen, which means night witch.
No.
And they
Oh.
used to be in gliders. And these women, you got to give it to them.
Yeah.
They didn't have a navigator. They didn't have anything except a flashlight and a map and their bombs. And they were in a glider, and it was made out of balsam wood
Yeah.
and cardboard and plywood. And
All lightweight material.
if they were hit with bullets, it would go up in
Yeah,
flames because
yeah.
they were riding and combustible.
Right.
And they would come in silently. That's why they call them night witches, because
Nice.
in the night they would come in and you couldn't hear them coming. And they would drop the bomb and then they would go out.
Mhm.
So any German soldier that shot down a Nachthexen got an Iron Cross.
Wow.
They
Okay.
were really afraid of those
Wow. I
women.
see.
And
Yeah, because they couldn't hear him
they
come.
coming,
Yeah,
couldn't see them
yeah.
coming because it was in the dark of night and they had no engine. You know, they
Yeah.
were just gliding. Yeah.
That's
But
interesting.
boy, that was nervy. I don't
So,
know if I could have done that.
yeah, that's that. So they had to tow them up into the air to
Mhm.
launch them,
Yeah,
and then
they glide in.
they have to glide in, and they have to know, I guess, beforehand if the conditions were favorable for
Mhm.
gliding, right? They had to
Yeah,
know
the
that
weather.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
But
And
they just
they
had a flashlight and a
they-
map. I mean, you know, and go into enemy territory, flashlight and a map, and you're their target. You're the one they want to shoot down the most. I mean, that was just very frightening, but they did it.
so so when the Rosies were in the factory during the day, for 10 hours,
Mhm.
uh, there must have been accidents and things like that because people were tired and, and they made mistakes. And so what
They
is
get a
it?
punch press and lose a finger.
Yeah, stuff like that.
They had the info.
Yeah.
They took care.
Okay.
But there were accidents. I don't know about deaths. I haven't really heard about deaths.
Yeah.
And I know things like that do happen on a factory floor, but I have heard about, serious injuries. So.
Okay. All right. So go on. Give me some more stories. Childcare, yes.
Childcare was a big important situation because all the women that came to the factory weren't single.
Yeah.
A lot of them were war brides or war wives.
Yeah.
And they had children and they were trying to support the family, and he's off to war. And they would come to the factories, and then what do you do with your kids? So some of the women left their kids at home with parents out of state, so you didn't see your kid for a couple of years. Or I even heard some stories, women put their kids in foster care.
Oh.
Because they for a couple of years or however long, and then they could get them back. But there was a little bit of daycare through Red Cross, but it wasn't sufficient for the amount of women. I mean, you had 40% of the 40,000 women working at Willow Run, and how many of those had kids? Red Cross just didn't have the wherewithal to handle all of that. And so a lot of the women worked between themselves. They would get together with someone with the opposite shift. And day shift worker would have her kids be with the afternoon woman. Afternoon worker would have her kids go with the day shift woman, and they would switch the kids out.
So they didn't have any kind of daycare at the plant, probably.
I don't know if there was maybe a little bit, but just nothing to handle everything. People just had to, the living, the food, the laundry, the children, those were all in addition to going into a factory, a place where women never had been, learning a skill you'd never done, working shift work you haven't done, and heavy lifting and being in a factory environment where women never were. They were retail clerks or maybe domestic help or a teacher or a nurse. They none of them ever worked like jobs like that before. And so you had all that additional pressure on top of everything. But the money was good. Willow Run money was really good, and people wanted to be at Willow Run, but they didn't want to look like they worked in a factory.
Oh, that's interesting.
When they ride the bus into the factory, they'd be all dressed really nice, and they'd have their little jumpsuit and a bag, and then they'd get to the factory and put it on over their clothes, go work, and then take it off to get back on the bus to go home, so they wouldn't look like a factory rat.
Factory rat.
Yeah.
So were there any
another local term?
Another local term. Yeah. So were there any social conflicts between the local people here and the people coming in from the South? Was there any,
I hadn't heard that happen. I think they were just so pleased to have people working and keeping the factory going and putting on additional shift. Because in the beginning it was just one shift, and then they had to make a second one. So they were getting the production done. They made 8,685 planes at Willow Run. And to make a B-24, that was like kind of the workhorse, and that was very important to have those planes. And then all around here, because that was like the arsenal, the hub of the arsenal of democracy, you had the tank factory. I think it's out Sterling Heights or somewhere out there. You had the Jeeps, the Willie Jeeps from Toledo. I mean, you just had, all around here, they were making parts. And even if they weren't making the actual Jeep or the airplane or the tank, they were making parts for it. They were working at the Ford foundry. They were making the steel. Can you imagine that job?
Oh,
I mean, it's a hard job for anybody, but can you imagine being a lady who was just a little housewife and she walks into that and that's her job?
Yeah.
It's frightening, I'm sure,
But it got done, apparently.
It did. They didn't have the proper clothing.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why we dress the way we dress when we pay tribute to them. We do the iconic from the poster with the polka dots and the blue jumpsuit, but there's a reason for the rolled up sleeves and the rolled up pant legs and all of those things. They all are significant to what Rosie dealt with when she went into a factory. Women in the day, they had their day dress. like their house dress,
Mhm.
then their day dress if they went to the market. They had their evening dress and they had their Sunday dress.
Mm.
You didn't have pants and jeans
Yeah.
and flannel shirts and work boots and, you had your little sandals, maybe loafers, maybe a saddle shoe. That was about as best you're gonna get on work clothes. So when women went into the factory to be up on the fuselage riveting, you can't be in your dress.
No.
I think it's dangerous.
Yeah, I
anyways.
would think that would, yeah.
I mean, I've seen some pictures where women were in sandals and dresses, but in the jobs that they were doing, it was more acceptable, But a lot of those jobs, there's no way you could wear sandals and a dress. So the women needed clothing. So where are you going to get it? Because all the clothes, everything was rationed.
Yeah.
They're not going to make all new clothes for these women. So you went into dad's closet, brother's closet, husband's closet, and you pulled out his big shirt and the sleeves were too long, so you rolled them up. You put on his pants. The pants were too long. You rolled those up.
I see.
They were falling off the hips. You put the belt on.
Yeah.
And that's where we get the rolled up outfit.
But they did have jumpsuits. Was that provided by
And
the
they had
fact?
to wear a belt around those and roll those up because they look like big clown clothes.
Yeah.
They were so huge. And they had, same thing, if it was shirt and pants or some of the jumpsuits. And there weren't enough for everybody, but if you got a jumpsuit.
Yeah.
And you didn't have work shoes, so you'd get, brother's shoes or something and stuff them with a rag. And they were clumpy. So we wear the clumpy boots, the marching boots. And then they had the red socks because those heavy red wool socks were warm. There's no heat in the factory.
Oh.
And we wear the red socks to honor that. There's no heat or air, but And so, and then the bandana, of course, was for safety to keep your hair tied back.
Yeah.
So that's why, but it's just the iconic look so people know and recognize who we represent when we walk outside. Because if we really look like a woman in a factory, we would have dad's flannel shirt and icky pants, it would be a different look. But we do that because people on site know those are Rosie's. Yeah. And they're representing what Rosie's did.
But anyways, all these, in this picture is implied all this background conditions that they had to deal with the clothing. If you look at that picture, it's saying, well, they had to, like you say, roll up their sleeves, roll up their pants. All this is implied because the factory didn't provide necessarily uniform.
But they didn't make women's clothes.
They didn't,
they didn't, and they weren't made. There was a point about halfway through, the women working at the factory, that they were just tired of it. And so they all stopped working one day and said, you get us clothes that fit us, or we're going to wear our street clothes in here.
Ooh.
So they started getting them some smaller jumpsuits. And, they took it serious. The women meant it. Yeah. Because to me, if you have big baggy clothes like that, that's just as unsafe as
well. It could get caught. Yeah, you could get caught.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, all right.
Who wants to look like a clown all day? I mean, really, those big puffy clown suits. So.
Okay. Any other topics we should cover today?
Well, I wanted to just talk just a little bit about. They did much more than just help with the war effort.
Okay.
They proved to the entire world that women were equal to men in the workplace. Mm-hmm. That you didn't just have to be a secretary or domestic help. You actually could, side by side, do the same job as a man. Mm-hmm. And RosieTheRiveter, the Rosies of the war, proved that. And that an apron and a house dress wasn't the only uniform that they should be seen wearing. Mm-hmm. And that out in the kitchen wasn't the only place they could successfully work. The women were strong in constitution and character and had a justified voice. They did this all without praise, fanfare, medals, or accolades. The men came home from war, they had victory parades, and and the women just went back in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. They did it because they were patriotic, and they did it for us all, and they did it for our future. And then they went home.
Well, I think we can end today's recording there, and hopefully we'll have another one where you come in as a Rosie.
Yeah.
and pretend that you are a Rosie.
Well, there are stories,
Yeah.
and they would be good to hear
Yeah.
from the eyes of a Rosie.
Yes.
Her story, and hear like from the interviews that we've had, the different Rosies that we've interviewed, and hearing what their particular strife that they went through, and what they thought and their fears they had.
Mhm.
So this was Rosie in general today, and maybe more specific next time.
Okay. Oh, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
We wish to thank Sue Murray for the very illuminating discussion about the World War II Rosies. There are few remaining Rosies alive from the World War II era, and we wish to acknowledge and honor their role in that conflict. Sue will return for a second interview in the near future where she will play a specific Rosie so as to give us a more intimate view of the life of a Rosie during the wartime. See you next time.
Great Lakes are a diamond on the hand of North America, a bright shining jewel on the friendship border ring. It's a freshwater highway coming down from Canada, and all along the coastline you can hear the people sing. Sweet Mother Michigan, Father Superior, coming down from Mackinac and Sault Ste. Marie. Blue water Huron rolls down to Lake Erie, falls into Ontario and runs on out to sea. Hardy are the seamen on the ships that load the iron ore,